Ch13 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 13. The Lady of the Pergola. April, April, laugh thy girlish laughter. Then, the moment after, wipe thy girlish tears. April, that mine ears like a lover greeteth, if I tell thee, sweetest, all my hopes and fears. April, April, laugh thy golden laughter, but, the moment after, weep thy golden tears. William Watson. A few photographs of foreign scenes tacked on the walls, a Roman blanket hung as tapestry over the mantel, a portfolio and traveller's writing materials distributed about a table produced for the purpose, and additions to the meagre bookshelf, a line of Baedeker's, a pocket atlas, a comprehensive American railway guide, several volumes of German and French poetry, and the place was not so bad. Armitage slept for an hour after a simple luncheon had been prepared by Oscar, studied his letters and cablegrams, made, in fact, some notes in regard to them, and wrote replies. Then, at 4 o'clock, he told Oscar to saddle the horses. "It is spring, and in April a man's blood will not be quiet. We shall go forth and taste the air." He had studied the map of Lamar County with care, and led the way out of his own preserve by the road over which they had entered in the morning. Oscar and his horses were a credit to the training of the American army, and would have passed inspection anywhere. Armitage watched his adjutant with approval. The man served without question, and, quicker of wit than of speech, his buff gauntleted hand went to his hat brim whenever Armitage addressed him. They sought again the spot whence Armitage had first looked down upon Storm Valley, and he opened his pocket map, the better to clarify his ideas of the region. "We shall go down into the valley, Oscar," he said, and thereafter it was he that led. They struck presently into an old road that had been an early highway across the mountains. Above and below the forest hung gloomily, and passing clouds darkened the slopes and occasionally spilled rain. Armitage drew on his cloak, and Oscar enveloped himself in a slicker as they rode through a sharp shower. At a lower level they came into fair weather again, and, crossing a bridge, rode down into Storm Valley. The road at once bore marks of care, and they passed a number of traps that spoke unmistakably of cities, and riders whose mounts knew well the bridle paths of Central Park. The hotel loomed massively before them, and beyond were handsome estates and ambitious mansions scattered through the valley and on the lower slopes. Armitage paused in a clump of trees and dismounted. "You will stay here until I come back, and remember that we don't know any one. At our time of life, Oscar, one should be wary of making new acquaintances." He tossed his cloak over the saddle and walked toward the inn. The size of the place and the great number of people coming and going surprised him, but in the numbers he saw his own security, and he walked boldly up the steps of the main hotel entrance. He stepped into the long corridor of the inn, where many people lounged about, and heard with keen satisfaction and relief the click of a telegraph instrument that seemed at once to bring him into contact with the remote world. He filed his telegrams and walked the length of the broad hall, his riding crop under his arm. The gay banter and laughter of a group of young men and women just returned from a drive gave him a touch of heartache, for there was a girl somewhere in the valley whom he had followed across the sea, and these people were of her own world. They undoubtedly knew her. Very likely she came often to this huge caravanserai and mingled with them. At the entrance he passed Baron von Marhof, who, by reason of the death of his royal chief, had taken a cottage at the Springs to emphasize his abstention from the life of the capital. The ambassador lifted his eyes and bowed to Armitage, as he bowed to a great many young men whose names he never remembered. But oddly enough, the Baron paused, stared after Armitage for a moment, then shook his head and walked on with knit brows. Armitage had lifted his hat and passed out, tapping his leg with his crop. He walked toward the private houses that lay scattered over the valley and along the gradual slope of the hills, as though carelessly flung from a dice-box. Many of the places were handsome estates, with imposing houses set amidst beautiful gardens. Half a mile from the hotel he stopped a passing negro to ask who owned a large house that stood well back from the road. The man answered. He seemed anxious to impart further information, and Armitage availed himself of the opportunity. "How near is Judge Claiborne's place?" he asked. The man pointed. It was the next house, on the right-hand side, and Armitage smiled to himself and strolled on. He looked down in a moment upon a pretty estate, distinguished by its formal garden, but with the broad acres of a practical farm stretching far out into the valley. The lawn terraces were green, broken only by plots of spring flowers. The walks were walled in box and privet. The house, of the pillared colonial type, crowned a series of terraces. A long pergola, with pillars topped by red urns, curved gradually through the garden toward the mansion. Armitage followed a side road along the brick partition wall and contemplated the inner landscape. The sharp snap of a gardener's shears far up the slopes was the only sound that reached him. It was a charming place, and he yielded to a temptation to explore it. He dropped over the wall and strolled away through the garden. The smell of warm earth, moist from the day's light showers, and the faint odor of green things growing, sweet in his nostrils. He walked to the far end of the pergola, sat down on a wooden bench, and gave himself up to reverie. He had been denounced as an impostor. He was on Claiborne's soil, and the situation required thought. It was while he was thus pondering his affairs that Shirley, walking over the soft lawn from a neighboring estate, came suddenly upon him. Her head went up with surprise and, he was sure, with disdain. She stopped abruptly as he jumped to his feet. "I am caught, in flagrante delicto. I can only plead guilty and pray for mercy." They said you had gone to Mexico," said Shirley questioningly. "Plague take the newspapers. How dare they misrepresent me?" He laughed. "Yes, I read those newspaper articles with a good deal of interest. And my brother—" "Yes, your brother. He is the best fellow in the world." She mused, but a smile of real mirth now played over her face and lighted her eyes. "Those are generous words, Mr. Armitage. My brother warned me against you in quite unequivocal language. He told me about your match-box." "Oh, the cigarette case," and he held it up. "It's really mine, and I'm going to keep it. It was very damaging evidence. It would argue strongly against me in any court of law." "Yes, I believe that is true," and she looked at the trinket with frank interest. "But I particularly do not wish to have to meet that charge in any court of law, Miss Claiborne." She met his gaze very steadily, and her eyes were grave. Then she asked, in much the same tone that she would have used if they had been very old friends, and he had excused himself for not riding that day, or for not going on a hunt or to the theatre, "Why?" "Because I have a pledge to keep and a work to do, and if I were forced to defend myself from the charge of being the false Baron von Kissel, everything would be spoiled. You see, unfortunately, most unfortunately, I am not quite without responsibilities, and I have come down into the mountains, where I hope not to be shot and tossed over a precipice until I have had time to watch certain people and certain events a little while. I tried to say as much to Captain Claiborne, but I saw that my story did not impress him, and now I have said the same thing to you." He waited, gravely watching her, hat in hand. "And I have stood here and listened to you, and done exactly what Captain Claiborne would not wish me to do under any circumstances," said Shirley. "You are infinitely kind and generous." "No, I do not wish you to think me either of those things. Of course not." Her conclusion was abrupt and pointed. Then I will tell you, what I have not told anyone else, that I know very well that you are not the person who appeared at Bar Harbor 3 years ago and palmed himself off as the Baron von Kissel." "You know it? You are quite sure of it?" he asked blankly. "Certainly. I saw that person at Bar Harbor. I had gone up from Newark for a week. I was even at a tea where he was quite the lion, and I am sure you are not the same person." Her direct manner of speech, her decisive tone, in which she placed the matter of his identity on a purely practical and unsentimental plane, gave him a new impression of her character. But Captain Claiborne—" He ceased suddenly, and she anticipated the question at which he had faltered, and answered, a little icily: "I do not consider it any of my business to meddle in your affairs with my brother. He undoubtedly believes you are the impostor who palmed himself off at the Bar Harbor as the Baron von Kissel. He was told so." "By Monsieur Chauvenet?" "So he said." "And of course he is a capital witness. There is no doubt of Chauvenet's entire credibility," declared Armitage a little airily. "I should say not," said Shirley unresponsively. "I am quite as sure that he was not the false baron as I am that you were not." Armitage laughed. "That is a little pointed." "It was meant to be," said Shirley sternly. "It is," she weighed the word, "ridiculous that both of you should be here." "Thank you, for my half. I didn't know he was here. But I am not exactly here. I have a much safer place." He swept the blue-hilled horizon with his hand. "Monsieur Chauvenet and I will not shoot at each other in the hotel dining-room. But I am really relieved that he has come. We have an interesting fashion of running into each other. It would positively grieve me to be obliged to wait long for him." He smiled and thrust his hat under his arm. The sun was dropping behind the great western barricade, and a chill wind crept sharply over the valley. He started to walk beside her as she turned away, but she paused abruptly. "Oh, this won't do at all. I can't be seen with you, even in the shadow of my own house. I must trouble you to take the side gate," and she indicated it by a nod of her head. "Not if I know myself. I am not a fraudulent member of the German nobility. You have told me so yourself. Your conscience is clear. I assure you mine is equally so. I am not a person, Miss Claiborne, to sneak out by side gates, particularly when I came in over the fence. It's a long way around anyhow, and I have a horse over there somewhere by the inn." "My brother—" "Is at Fort Myer, of course, and about this hour they are having dress parade, and he is thoroughly occupied." "But there's Monsieur Chauvenet. He has nothing to do but amuse himself." They had reached the veranda steps, and she ran to the top and turned for a moment to look at him. He still carried his hat and crop in one hand, and had dropped the other into the side pocket of his coat. He was wholly at ease, and the wind ruffled his hair and gave him a boyish look that Shirley liked. But she had no wish to be found with him, and she instantly nodded his dismissal and half turned away to go into the house, when he detained her for a moment. "I am perfectly willing to afford Monsieur Chauvenet all imaginable entertainment. We are bound to have many meetings. I am afraid he reached this charming valley before me, but, as a rule, I prefer to be a little ahead of him. It's a whim, the merest whim, I assure you." He laughed, thinking little of what he said, but delighting in the picture she made, the tall pillars of the veranda framing her against the white wall of the house, and the architrave high above speaking, so he thought, for the amplitude, the breadth of her nature. Her green cloth gown afforded the happiest possible contrast with the white background, and her hat, for a gown, let us remember, may express the dressmaker, but a hat expresses the woman who wears it. Her hat, Armitage was aware, was a trifle of black velvet caught up at one side with snowy plumes well calculated to shock the sensibilities of the Audubon Society. Yet the bird, if he knew, doubtless rejoiced in his fate. Shirley's hand, thrice laid down, and there you have the length of that velvet cap, plume and all. Her profile, as she half turned away, must awaken regret that Reynolds and Gainsborough paint no more. Yet let us be practical. Sargent, in this particular, could not serve us ill. Her annoyance at finding herself lingering to listen to him was marked by an almost imperceptible gathering of her brows. It was all the matter of an instant. His heart beat fast in his joy at the sight of her, and the tongue that years of practice had skilled in reserve and evasion was possessed by a reckless spirit. She nodded carelessly, but said nothing, waiting for him to go on. "But when I wait for people, they always come, even in a strange pergola," he added daringly. "Now, in Geneva, not long ago." He lost the profile and gained her face as he liked it best, though her head was lifted a little high in resentment against her own yielding curiosity. He was speaking rapidly, and the slight hint of some other tongue than his usually fluent English arrested her ear now, as it had at other times. In Geneva, when I told a young lady that I was waiting for a very wicked man to appear, it was really the oddest thing in the world that almost immediately Monsieur Jules Chauvenet arrived at mine own inn. It is inevitable, it is always sure to be my fate," he concluded mournfully. He bowed low, restoring the shabby hat to his head with the least bit of a flourish, and strolled away through the garden by a broad walk that led to the front gate. He would have been interested to know that when he was out of sight Shirley walked to the veranda rail and bent forward, listening to his steps on the gravel, after the hedge and shrubbery had hidden him, and she stood thus until the faint click of the gate told her that he had gone. She did not know that as the gate closed upon him, he met Chauvenet face to face. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 14. An Enforced Interview. En garde, messieurs. And if my hand is hard, remember I've been buffeting at will. I am a whit impatient, and 'tis ill to cross a hungry dog. Messieurs, en garde. W. Lindsay. Monsieur Chauvenet? Armitage uncovered smilingly. Chauvenet stared mutely as Armitage paused with his back at the Claiborne gate. Chauvenet was dressed with his usual care, and wore the latest carnation in the lapel of his topcoat. He struck the ground with his stick. His look of astonishment passed, and he smiled pleasantly as he returned Armitage's salutation. "My dear Armitage," he murmured, "I didn't go to Mexico after all, my good Chauvenet. The place is full of fevers. I couldn't take the risk." "He is indeed a wise man who safeguards his health," replied the other. "You are quite right, and when one has had many narrow escapes, one may be excused for exercising rather particular care. Do you not find it so?" mocked Armitage. "My dear fellow, my life is one long fight against ennui. Danger, excitement, the hazard of my precious life, such pleasures of late have been denied me." "But you are young and of intrepid spirit, monsieur. It would be quite surprising if some perilous adventure did not overtake you before the silver gets into your hair." "Ah, I assure you the speculation interests me. But I must trouble you to let me pass," continued Chauvenet in the same tone. "I shall quite forget that I set out to make a call if I linger longer in your charming society." "But I must ask you to delay your call for the present. I shall greatly value your company down the road a little way. It is a trifling favor, and you are a man of delightful courtesy." Chauvenet twisted his moustache reflectively. His mind had been busy seeking means of turning the meeting to his own advantage. He had met Armitage at quite the least imaginable spot in the world for an encounter between them, and he was not a man who enjoyed surprises. He had taken care that the exposure of Armitage at Washington should be telegraphed to every part of the country and put upon the cables. He had expected Armitage to leave Washington, but he had no idea that he would turn up at a fashionable resort greatly affected by Washingtonians and only a comparatively short distance from the capital. He was at a great disadvantage in not knowing Armitage's plans and strategy. His own mind was curiously cunning, and his reasoning powers traversed oblique lines. He was thus prone to impute similar mental processes to other people. Simplicity and directness he did not understand at all. He had underrated Armitage's courage and daring. He wished to make no further mistakes, and he walked back toward the hotel with apparent good grace. Armitage spoke now in a very different key, and the change displeased Chauvenet, for he much affected ironical raillery, and his companion's sterner tones disconcerted him. "I take this opportunity to give you a solemn warning, Monsieur Jules Chauvenet, alias Rambaud, and thereby render you a greater service than you know. You have undertaken a deep and dangerous game. It is spectacular. It is picturesque. It is immense. It is so stupendous that the taking of a few lives seems trifling in comparison with the end to be attained. Now look about you for a moment, Monsieur Jules Chauvenet. In this mountain air a man may grow very sane and see matters very clearly. London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, they are a long way off, and the things they stand for lose their splendor when a man sits among these American mountains and reflects upon the pettiness and sordidness of man's common ambitions." "Is this exordium or peroration, my dear fellow?" "It is both," replied Armitage succinctly, and Chauvenet was sorry he had spoken, for Armitage stopped short in a lonely stretch of the highway and continued in a disagreeable, incisive tone. "I ran away from Washington after you told that story at Claiborne's supper table, not because I was afraid of your accusation, but because I wanted to watch your plans in a little security. The only man who could have helped me immediately was Senator Sanderson, and I knew that he was in Montana." Chauvenet smiled with a return of assurance. "Of course, the hour was chosen well. More wisely, in fact, than your choice of that big assassin of yours. He's a clumsy fellow, with more brawn than brains. I had no trouble in shaking him off in Boston, where you probably advised him I should be taking the Montreal express." Chauvenet blinked. This was precisely what he had told Zmai to expect. He shifted from one foot to another, and wondered just how he was to escape from Armitage. He had gone to Storm Springs to be near Shirley Claiborne, and he deeply resented having business thrust upon him. "He is a wise man who wields the knife himself, Monsieur Chauvenet. In the taking of poor Count von Stroebel's life so deftly and secretly, you prove my philosophy. It was a clever job, monsieur." Chauvenet's gloved fingers caught at his moustache. "That is almost insulting, Monsieur Armitage. A distinguished statesman is killed, therefore I must have murdered him. You forget that there's a difference between us. You are an unknown adventurer, carried on the books of the police as a fugitive from justice, and I can walk to the hotel and get 20 reputable men to vouch for me. I advise you to be careful not to mention my name in connection with Count von Stroebel's death." He had begun haughtily, but closed in heat, and when he finished Armitage nodded to signify that he understood perfectly. "A few more deaths and you would be in a position to command tribute from a high quarter, monsieur." "Your mind seems to turn upon assassination. If you know so much about Stroebel's death, it's unfortunate that you left Europe at a time when you might have rendered important aid in finding the murderer. It's a bit suspicious, Monsieur Armitage. It is known at the Hotel Monte Rosa in Geneva that you were the last person to enjoy an interview with the venerable statesman. You see, I am not dull, Monsieur Armitage." "You are not dull, Chauvenet. You are only short-sighted. The same witnesses know that John Armitage was at the Hotel Monte Rosa for 24 hours following the Count's departure. Meanwhile, where were you, Jules Chauvenet?" Chauvenet's hand went again to his face, which whitened, though he sought refuge again in flippant irony. "To be sure. Where was I, monsieur? Undoubtedly you know all my movements, so that it is unnecessary for me to have any opinion in the matter." "Quite so. Your opinions are of no great value to me, for I employed agents to trace every move you made during the month in which Count von Stroebel was stabbed to death in his railway carriage. It is so interesting that I have committed the record to memory. If the story would interest you—" The hand that again sought the slight moustache trembled slightly, but Chauvenet smiled. "You should write the memoirs of your very interesting career, my dear fellow. I cannot listen to your babble longer." "I do not intend that you shall, but your whereabouts on Monday night, March 18th, of this year, may need explanation, Monsieur Chauvenet." "If it should, I shall call upon you, my dear fellow." "Save yourself the trouble. The bureau I employed to investigate the matter could assist you much better. All I could offer would be copies of its very thorough reports. The number of cups of coffee your friend Durand drank for breakfast this morning at his lodgings in Vienna will reach me in due course." "You are really a devil of a fellow, John Armitage. So much knowledge, so acute an intellect. You are too wise to throw away your life futilely." "You have been most generous in sparing it thus far," laughed Armitage, and Chauvenet took instant advantage of his change of humor. "Perhaps. Perhaps I have pledged my faith in the wrong quarter, monsieur. If I may say it, we are both fairly clever men. Together we could achieve much." "So you would sell out, would you?" laughed Armitage. "You miserable little blackguard. I should like to join forces with you. Your knack of getting the poison into the right cup every time would be a valuable asset. But we are not made for each other in this world. In the next, who knows?" "As you will. I dare say you would be an exacting partner." "All of that, Chauvenet. You do best to stick to your present employer. He needs you and the like of you. I don't. But remember, if there's a sudden death in Vienna, in a certain high quarter, you will not live to reap the benefits. Charles Louis rules Austria-Hungary. His cousin, your friend Francis, is not of kingly proportions. I advise you to cable the admirable Durand of a dissolution of partnership. It is now too late for you to call at Judge Claiborne's, and I shall trouble you to walk on down the road for 10 minutes. If you look round or follow me, I shall certainly turn you into something less attractive than a pillar of salt. You do well to consult your watch. Forward." Armitage pointed down the road with his riding crop. As Chauvenet walked slowly away, swinging his stick, Armitage turned toward the hotel. The shadow of night was enfolding the hills, and it was quite dark when he found Oscar and the horses. He mounted, and they rode through the deepening April dusk, up the winding trail that led out of Storm Valley. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 15. Shirley Learns a Secret. Nightingales warble about it all night under blossom and star. The wild swan is dying without it, and the eagle crieth afar. The sun, he doth mount but to find it searching the green earth o'er. But more doth a man's heart mind it, oh more, more, more. G. E. Woodbury. Shirley Claiborne was dressed for a ride, and while waiting for her horse she reread her brother's letter, and the postscript which follows she read twice. "I shall never live down my acquaintance with the delectable Armitage. My brother officers insist on rubbing it in. I even hear, ma chérie, that you have gone into retreat by reason of the exposure. I'll admit, for your consolation, that he really took me in, and further, I really wonder who the devil he is, or was. Our last interview at the club, after Chauvenet told his story, lingers with me disagreeably. I was naturally pretty hot to find him playing the darkly mysterious, which never did go with me, after eating my bird and drinking my bottle. As a precaution I have looked up Chauvenet to the best of my ability. At the Austro-Hungarian embassy they speak well of him. He's over here to collect the price of a few cruisers or some such rubbish from one of our sister republics below the Gulf. But bad luck to all foreigners. Me for America every time. Dear old Dick. And she dropped the letter into a drawer and went out into the sunshine, mounted her horse, and turned toward the hills. She had spent the intermediate seasons of the year at Storm Springs ever since she could remember, and had climbed the surrounding hills and dipped into the valleys with a boy's zest and freedom. The Virginia mountains were linked in her mind to the dreams of her youth, to her earliest hopes and aspirations, and to the books she had read, and she galloped happily out of the valley to the tune of an old ballad. She rode as a woman should, astride her horse, and not madly clinging to it in the preposterous ancient fashion. She had known horses from early years, in which she had tumbled from her pony's back in the stable-yard, and she knew how to train a horse to a gait, and how to master a beast's fear, and even some of the tricks of the troopers in the Fort Myer drill she had surreptitiously practiced in the meadow back of the Claiborne stable. It was on Tuesday that John Armitage had appeared before her in the pergola. It was now Thursday afternoon, and Chauvenet had been to see her twice since, and she had met him the night before at a dance at one of the cottages. Judge Claiborne was distinguished for his acute and sinewy mind, but he had, too, a strong feeling for art in all its expressions, and it was his gift of imagination, the ability to forecast the enemy's strategy and then strike its weakest point, that had made him a great lawyer and diplomat. Shirley had played chess with her father until she had learned to see around corners as he did, and she liked a problem, a test of wit, a contest of powers. She knew how to wait and ponder in silence, and therein lay the joy of the saddle, when she could ride alone with no groom to bother her, and watch enchantments unfold on the hilltops. Once free of the settlement she rode far and fast, until she was quite beyond the usual routes of the spring excursionists. Then in the mountain byways she enjoyed the luxury of leisure, and dismounted now and then to delight in the green of the laurel and question the rhododendrons. Jules Chauvenet had scoured the hills all day, and explored many mountain paths and inquired cautiously of the natives. The telegraph operator at the Storm Springs Inn was a woman, and the dispatch and receipt by Jules Chauvenet of long messages, many of them in cipher, piqued her curiosity. No member of the Washington diplomatic circle who came to the Springs, not even the shrewd and secretive Russian ambassador, received longer or more cryptic cables. With the social diversions of the Springs and the necessity for making a show of having some legitimate business in America, Jules Chauvenet was pretty well occupied, and now the presence of John Armitage in Virginia added to his burdens. He was tired and perplexed, and it was with unaffected pleasure that he rode out of an obscure hill path into a bit of open wood overhanging a curious defile, and came upon Shirley Claiborne. The soil was soft, and his horse carried him quite near before she heard him. A broad sheet of water flashed down the farther side of the narrow pass, sending up a pretty spurt of spray whenever it struck the jutting rock. As Shirley turned toward him, he urged his horse over the springy turf. "A pity to disturb the picture, Miss Claiborne. 1,000 pardons. But I really wished to see whether the figure could come out of the canvas. Now that I have dared to make the test, pray do not send me away." Her horse turned restively, and brought her face to face with Chauvenet. "Steady, Fanny. Don't come near her, please." This last to Chauvenet, who had leaped down and put out his hand to her horse's bridle. She had the true horsewoman's pride in caring for herself, and her eyes flashed angrily for a moment at Chauvenet's proffered aid. A man might open a door for her, or pick up her handkerchief, but to touch her horse was an altogether different business. The pretty, graceful mare was calm in a moment, and arched her neck contentedly under the stroke of Shirley's hand. "Beautiful. The picture is even more perfect, mademoiselle." "Fanny is best in action, and splendid when she runs away. She hasn't run away to-day, but I think she is likely to before I get home." She was thinking of the long ride which she had no intention of taking in Chauvenet's company. He stood uncovered beside her, holding his horse. "But the danger, mademoiselle. You should not hazard your life with a runaway horse on these roads. It is not fair to your friends." "You are a conservative, monsieur. I should be ashamed to have a runaway in a city park. But what does one come to the country for?" "What, indeed, but for excitement? You are not one of those tame young women across the sea, who come out into the world from a convent, frightened at all they see, and whisper, 'Yes, sister, no, sister,' to everything they hear." "Yes, we Americans are deficient in shyness and humility. I have often heard it remarked, Monsieur Chauvenet." "No, no, you misunderstand. These deficiencies, as you term them, are delightful. They are what give the charm to the American woman. I hope you would not believe me capable of speaking in disparagement, mademoiselle. You must know—" The water tumbled down the rock into the vale. The soft air was sweet with the scent of pines. An eagle cruised high against the blue overhead. Shirley's hand tightened on the rein, and Fanny lifted her head expectantly. Chauvenet went on rapidly in French. "You must know why I am here, why I have crossed the sea to seek you in your own home. I have loved you, mademoiselle, from the moment I first saw you in Florence. Here, with only the mountains, the sky, the wood, I must speak. You must hear. You must believe that I love you. I offer you my life, my poor attainments." "Monsieur, you do me a great honor, but I cannot listen. What you ask is impossible, quite impossible. But, monsieur, Her eyes had fallen upon a thicket behind him, where something had stirred. She thought at first that it was an animal of some sort, but she saw now quite distinctly a man's shabby felt hat that rose slowly until the bearded face of its wearer was disclosed. "Monsieur," cried Shirley in a low tone, "look behind you, and be careful what you say or do. Leave the man to me." Chauvenet turned and faced a scowling mountaineer who held a rifle and drew it to his shoulder as Chauvenet threw out his arms, dropped them to his thighs, and laughed carelessly. "What is it, my dear fellow? My watch? My purse? My horse?" he said in English. "He wants none of those things," said Shirley, urging her horse a few steps toward the man. "The mountain people are not robbers. What can we do for you?" she asked pleasantly. "You can't do nothing for me," drawled the man. "Go on away, miss. I want to see this little fella. I got a little business with him." "He is a foreigner. He knows little of our language. You will do best to let me stay," said Shirley. She had not the remotest idea of what the man wanted, but she had known the mountain folk from childhood, and well understood that familiarity with their ways and tact were necessary in dealing with them. "Miss, I've seen you before, and I reckon we ain't got no cause for trouble with you. But this little fella ain't no business up here. Them hotel people has their own places to ride and drive, and it's all right for you, miss. But what's your friend riding the hills for at night? He's looking for someone, and I reckon as how that someone are me." He spoke drawlingly, with a lazy good humor in his tones, and Shirley's wits took advantage of his deliberation to consider the situation from several points of view. Chauvenet stood looking from Shirley to the man and back again. He was by no means a coward, and he did not in the least relish the thought of owing his safety to a woman. But the confidence with which Shirley addressed the man, and her apparent familiarity with the peculiarities of the mountaineers impressed him. He spoke to her rapidly in French. "Assure the man that I have never heard of him before in my life, that the idea of seeking him never occurred to me." The rifle, a repeater of the newest type, went to the man's shoulder in a flash, and the blue barrel pointed at Chauvenet's head. "None of that. I reckon the American language air good enough for these 'ere negotiations." Chauvenet shrugged his shoulders, but he gazed into the muzzle of the rifle unflinchingly. "The gentleman was merely explaining that you are mistaken, that he does not know you, and never heard of you before, and that he has not been looking for you in the mountains or anywhere else." As Shirley spoke these words very slowly and distinctly, she questioned for the first time Chauvenet's position. Perhaps, after all, the mountaineer had a real cause of grievance. It seemed wholly unlikely, but while she listened to the man's reply she weighed the matter judicially. They were in an unfrequented part of the mountains, which cottagers and hotel guests rarely explored. The mountaineer was saying, "Mountain folk air slow, and we don't know much, but a stranger don't ride through these hills more than once for the scenery. And the second time he's got to tell why. And the third time, well, miss, you can tell the little feller that there ain't no third time." Chauvenet flushed, and he ejaculated hotly, "I have never been here before in my life." The man dropped the rifle into his arm without taking his eyes from Chauvenet. He said succinctly, but still with his drawl, "You air alive, sir." Chauvenet took a step forward, looked again into the rifle barrel, and stopped short. Fanny, bored by the prolonged interview, bent her neck and nibbled at a weed. "This gentleman has been in America only a few weeks. You are certainly mistaken, friend," said Shirley boldly. Then the color flashed into her face as an explanation of the mountaineer's interest in a stranger riding the hills occurred to her. "My friend," she said, "I am Miss Claiborne. You may know my father's house down in the valley. We have been coming here as far back as I can remember." The mountaineer listened to her gravely, and at her last words he unconsciously nodded his head. Shirley, seeing that he was interested, seized her advantage. "I have no reason for misleading you. This gentleman is not a revenue man. He probably never heard of a still, do you call it, in his life." And she smiled upon him sweetly. "But if you will let him go, I promise to satisfy you entirely in the matter." Chauvenet started to speak, but Shirley arrested him with a gesture, and spoke again to the mountaineer in her most engaging tone. "We are both mountaineers, you and I, and we don't want any of our people to be carried off to jail. Isn't that so? Now let this gentleman ride away, and I shall stay here until I have quite assured you that you are mistaken about him." She signalled Chauvenet to mount, holding the mystified and reluctant mountaineer with her eyes. Her heart was thumping fast, and her hand shook a little as she tightened her grasp on the rein. She addressed Chauvenet in English as a mark of good faith to their captor. "Ride on, monsieur. Do not wait for me." "But it is growing dark. I cannot leave you alone, mademoiselle. You have rendered me a great service, when it is I who should have extricated you." "Pray do not mention it. It is a mere chance that I am able to help. I shall be perfectly safe with this gentleman." The mountaineer took off his hat. "Thank ye, miss," he said, and then to Chauvenet, "Get out." "Don't trouble about me in the least, Monsieur Chauvenet," and Shirley affirmed the last word with a nod as Chauvenet jumped into his saddle and rode off. When the swift gallop of his horse had carried him out of sight and sound down the road, Shirley faced the mountaineer. "What is your name?" "Tom Selfridge." "Whom did you take this man to be, Mr. Selfridge?" asked Shirley, and in her eagerness she bent down above the mountaineer's bared tangle of tow.
"The name you called him ain't it. It's a queer name I never heerd tell of before. It's like the army."
"Is it Armitage?" asked Shirley quickly.
"That's it, miss. The postmaster over at Lamar told me to look out for him. He's moved up here, and it ain't for no good. The word's out that a city man's looking for something or somebody in these hills, and the man's staying—"
"Where?"
"At the hunting club, where folks don't go no more. I ain't seen him, but the word's passed. He's a city man and a stranger, and got a little feller that's been a soldier in the army staying with him. I thought your foreigner was him, miss. Honest to God I did."
The incident amused Shirley, and she laughed aloud. She had undoubtedly gained information that Chauvenet had gone forth to seek. She had, and the thing was funny, served Chauvenet well in explaining away his presence in the mountains and getting him out of the clutches of the mountaineer, while at the same time she was learning for herself the fact of Armitage's whereabouts and keeping it from Chauvenet. It was a curious adventure, and she gave her hand smilingly to the mystified and still doubting mountaineer. "I give you my word of honor that neither man is a government officer, and that neither one has the slightest interest in you. Will you believe me?"
"I reckon I got to, miss."
"Good. And now, Mr. Selfridge, it's growing dark, and I want you to walk down this trail with me until we come to the Storm Springs road."
"I'll do it gladly, miss."
"Thank you. Now let us be off." She made him turn back when they reached a point from which they could look out upon the electric lights of the Springs colony, and where the big hotel and its piazza shone like a steamship at night. A moment later, Chauvenet, who had waited impatiently, joined her, and they rode down together. She referred at once to the affair with the mountaineer in her most frivolous key. "They are an odd and suspicious people, but they're as loyal as the stars. And please let us never mention the matter again. Not to anyone, if you please, monsieur." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 16. Narrow Margins. The black caps pipe among the reeds, and there'll be rain to follow. There is a murmur as of wind in every coign and hollow. The wrens do chatter of their fears while swinging on the barley ears. Amelie Rives. The judge and Mrs. Claiborne were dining with some old friends in the valley, and Shirley, left alone, carried to the table several letters that had come in the late mail. The events of the afternoon filled her mind, and she was not sorry to be alone. It occurred to her that she was building up a formidable tower of strange secrets, and she wondered whether, having begun by keeping her own counsel as to the attempts she had witnessed against John Armitage's life, she ought now to unfold all she knew to her father, or to Dick. In the 20th century, homicide was not a common practice among men she knew, or was likely to know, and the feeling of culpability for her silence crossed lances with a deepening sympathy for Armitage. She had learned where he was hiding, and she smiled at the recollection of the trifling bit of strategy she had practiced upon Chauvenet. The maid who served Shirley noted with surprise the long pauses in which her young mistress sat staring across the table, lost in reverie. A pretty picture was Shirley in these intervals, one hand raised to her cheek, bright from the sting of the spring wind in the hills. Her forearm, white and firm and strong, was circled by a band of Roman gold, the only ornament she wore, and when she lifted her hand with its quick, deft gesture, the trinket flashed away from her wrist and clasped the warm flesh as though in joy of closer intimacy. Her hair was swept up high from her brow. Her nose, straight like her father's, was saved from arrogance by a sensitive mouth, all eloquent kindness and wholesome mirth. But we take unfair advantage. A girl dining in candlelight with only her dreams for company should be safe from impertinent eyes. She had kept Dick's letter till the last. He wrote often and in the key of his talk. She dropped a lump of sugar into her coffee cup and read his hurried scrawl. "What do you think has happened now? I have $14 worth of telegrams from Sanderson, writing from some godforsaken hole in Montana, that it's all rot about Armitage being that fake Baron von Kissel. The newspaper accounts of the exposé at my supper party had just reached him, and he says Armitage was on Armitage's, ranch all that summer the noble Baron was devastating our northern seacoast. Where, may I ask, does this leave me? And what cad gave that story to the papers? And where, and who is John Armitage? Keep this mum for the present, even from the governor. If Sanderson is right, Armitage will undoubtedly turn up again. He has a weakness for turning up in your neighborhood, and sooner or later he's bound to settle accounts with Chauvenet. Now that I think of it, who the devil is he? And why didn't Armitage call him, down there at the club? As I think over the whole business, my mind grows addled, and I feel as though I'd been kicked by a horse." Shirley laughed softly, keeping the note open before her and referring to it musingly as she stirred her coffee. She could not answer any of Dick's questions, but her interest in the contest between Armitage and Chauvenet was intensified by this latest turn in the affair. She read for an hour in the library, but the air was close, and she threw aside her book, drew on a light coat, and went out upon the veranda. A storm was stealing down from the hills, and the fitful wind tasted of rain. She walked the length of the veranda several times, then paused at the farther end of it, where steps led out to the pergola. There was still a mist of starlight, and she looked out upon the vague outlines of the garden with thoughts of its needs and the gardener's work for the morrow. Then she was aware of a light step far out in the pergola, and listened carelessly to mark it, thinking it one of the house servants returning from the neighbors. But the sound was furtive, and as she waited, it ceased abruptly. She was about to turn into the house to summon help, when she heard a stir in the shrubbery in quite another part of the garden, and in a moment the stooping figure of a man moved swiftly toward the pergola. Shirley stood quite still, watching and listening. The sound of steps in the pergola reached her again, then the rush of flight, and out in the garden a flying figure darted in and out among the walks. For several minutes 2 dark figures played at vigorous hide-and-seek. Occasionally gravel crunched underfoot, and shrubbery snapped back with a sharp swish where it was caught and held for support at corners. Pursued and pursuer were alike silent. The scene was like a pantomime. Then the table seemed to be turned. The bulkier figure of the pursuer was now in flight, and Shirley lost both for a moment, but immediately a dark form rose at the wall. She heard the scratch of feet upon the brick surface as a man gained the top, turned and lifted his arm as though aiming a weapon. Then a dark object hurled through the air, struck him squarely in the face, and he tumbled over the wall, and Shirley heard him crash through the hedge of the neighboring estate. Then all was quiet again. The game of hide-and-seek in the garden and the scramble over the wall had consumed only 2 or 3 minutes, and Shirley now waited, her eyes bent upon the darkly outlined pergola for some manifestation of the remaining intruder. A man now walked rapidly toward the veranda, carrying a cloak on his arm. She recognized Armitage instantly. He doffed his hat and bowed. The lights of the house lamps shone full upon him, and she saw that he was laughing a little breathlessly. "This is really fortunate, Miss Claiborne. I owe your house an apology, and if you will grant me audience I will offer it to you." He threw the cloak over his shoulder and fanned himself with his hat. "You are a most informal person, Mr. Armitage," said Shirley coldly. "I'm afraid I am. The most amazing ill luck follows me. I had dropped in to enjoy the quiet charm of your garden, but the tranquil life is not for me. There was another gentleman, equally bent on enjoying the pergola. We engaged in a pretty running match, and because I was fleeter of foot, he grew ugly and tried to put me out of commission." He was still laughing, but Shirley felt that he was again trying to make light of a serious situation, and a further tie of secrecy with Armitage was not to her liking. As he walked boldly to the veranda steps, she stepped back from him. "No, no, this is impossible. It will not do at all, Mr. Armitage. It is not kind of you to come here in this strange fashion." "In this way, forsooth. How could I send my card when I was being chased all over the estate? I didn't mean to apologize for coming," and he laughed again, with a sincere mirth that shook her resolution to deal harshly with him. "But," he went on, "it was the flower pot. He was mad because I beat him in the foot race and wanted to shoot me from the wall, and I tossed him a potted geranium. Geraniums are splendid for the purpose, and it caught him square in the head. I have a knack of it. Once before I handed him a boiling pot." "It must have hurt him," said Shirley, and he laughed at her tone that was meant to be severe. "I certainly hope so. I most devoutly hope he felt it. He was most tenderly solicitous for my health, and if he had really shot me there in the garden it would have had an ugly look. Armitage, the false baron, would have been identified as a darling burglar, shot while trying to burglarize the Claiborne mansion. But I wouldn't take the Claiborne plate for anything, I assure you." "I suppose you didn't think of us, all of us, and the unpleasant consequences to my father and brother if something disagreeable happened here?" There was real anxiety in her tone, and he saw that he was going too far with his light treatment of the affair. His tone changed instantly. "Please forgive me. I would not cause embarrassment or annoyance to any member of your family for kingdoms. I didn't know I was being followed. I had come here to see you. That is the truth of it." "You mustn't try to see me. You mustn't come here at all unless you come with the knowledge of my father. And the very fact that your life is sought so persistently, at most unusual times and in impossible places, leaves very much to explain." "I know that. I realize all that." "Then you must not come. You must leave instantly." She walked away toward the front door, but he followed, and at the door she turned to him again. They were in the full glare of the door lamps, and she saw that his face was very earnest, and as he began to speak he flinched and shifted the cloak awkwardly. "You have been hurt. Why did you not tell me that?" "It is nothing. The fellow had a knife, and but it's only a trifle in the shoulder. I must be off." The lightning had several times leaped sharply out of the hills. The wind was threshing the garden foliage, and now the rain roared on the tin roof of the veranda. As he spoke a carriage rolled into the grounds and came rapidly toward the porte cochere. "I'm off. Please believe in me, a little." "You must not go if you are hurt, and you can't run away now. My father and mother are at the door." There was an instant's respite while the carriage drew up to the veranda steps. She heard the stable boy running out to help with the horses. "You can't go now. Come in and wait." There was no time for debate. She flung open the door and swept him past her with a gesture, through the library and beyond, into a smaller room used by Judge Claiborne as an office. Armitage sank down on a leather couch as Shirley flung the portieres together with a sharp rattle of the rod rings. She walked toward the hall door as her father and mother entered from the veranda. "Ah, Miss Claiborne, your father and mother picked me up and brought me in out of the rain. Your Storm Valley is giving us a taste of its powers." And Shirley went forward to greet Baron von Marhof. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 17. A Gentleman in Hiding. Oh, sweetly fall the April days. My love was made of frost and light, of light to warm and frost to blight, the sweet, strange April of her ways. Eyes like a dream of changing skies, and every frown and blush I prize. With cloud and flush the spring comes in, with frown and blush maids' loves begin, for love is rare like April days. L. Frank Tooker. Mrs. Claiborne excused herself shortly, and Shirley, her father, and the ambassador talked to the accompaniment of the shower that drove in great sheets against the house. Shirley was wholly uncomfortable over the turn of affairs. The ambassador would not leave until the storm abated, and meanwhile Armitage must remain where he was. If by any chance he should be discovered in the house, no ordinary excuses would explain away his presence, and as she pondered the matter, it was Armitage's plight, his injuries and the dangers that beset him, that was uppermost in her mind. The embarrassment that lay in the affair for herself if Armitage should be found concealed in the house troubled her little. Her heart beat wildly as she realized this, and the look in his eyes and the quick pain that twitched his face at the door haunted her. The two men were talking of the new order of things in Vienna. "The trouble is," said the ambassador, "that Austria-Hungary is not a nation, but what Metternich called Italy, a geographical expression. Where there are so many loose ends, a strong grasp is necessary to hold them together." "And a weak hand," suggested Judge Claiborne, "might easily lose or scatter them." "Precisely. And a man of character and spirit could topple down the card-house to-morrow, pick out what he liked, and create for himself a new edifice, and a stronger one. I speak frankly. Von Stroebel is out of the way. The new Empire King is a weakling, and if he should die tonight or tomorrow—" The ambassador lifted his hands and snapped his fingers. "Yes, after him, what?" "After him his scoundrelly cousin Francis. And then, a stronger than von Stroebel might easily fail to hold the disjecta membra of the Empire together." "But there are shadows on the screen," remarked Judge Claiborne. "There was Karl, the mad prince." "Humph! There was some red blood in him, but he was impossible. He had a taint of democracy, treason, rebellion." Judge Claiborne laughed. "I don't like the combination of terms. If treason and rebellion are synonyms of democracy, we Americans are in danger." "No, you are a miracle, and that is the only explanation," replied Marhof. "But a man like Karl, what if he were to reappear in the world? A little democracy might solve your problem." "No, thank God, he is out of the way. He was sane enough to take himself off and die." "But his ghost walks. Not a year ago we heard of him, and he had a son who chose his father's exile. What if Charles Louis, who is without heirs, should die, and Karl, or his son—" "In the providence of God they are dead. Impostors gain a little brief notoriety by pretending to be the lost Karl, or his son Frederick Augustus. But von Stroebel satisfied himself that Karl was dead. I am quite sure of it. You know dear Stroebel had a genius for gaining information." "I have heard as much." And Shirley and the Baron smiled at Judge Claiborne's tone. The storm was diminishing, and Shirley grew more tranquil. Soon the ambassador would leave, and she would send Armitage away. But the mention of Stroebel's name rang oddly in her ears, and the curious way in which Armitage and Chauvenet had come into her life awoke new and anxious questions. "Count von Stroebel was not a democrat, at any rate," she said. "He believed in the divine right and all that." "So do I, Miss Claiborne. It's all we've got to stand on." "But suppose a democratic prince were to fall heir to one of the European thrones, insist on giving his crown to the poor and taking his oath in a frock-coat, upsetting the old order entirely." "He would be a fool, and the people would drag him to the block in a week," declared the Baron vigorously. They pursued the subject in lighter vein a few minutes longer. Then the Baron rose. Judge Claiborne summoned the waiting carriage from the stable, and the Baron drove home. "I ought to work for an hour on that Danish claims matter," remarked the judge, glancing toward his curtained den. You will do nothing of the kind. Night work is not permitted in the valley."
"Thank you. I hoped you would say that, Shirley. I believe I am tired. Now, if you will find a magazine for me, I'll go to bed. Ring for Thomas to close the house."
"I have a few notes to write. They'll only take a minute, and I'll write them here." She heard her father's door close, listened to be quite sure that the house was quiet, and threw back the curtains. Armitage stepped out into the library. "You must go. You must go," she whispered with deep tensity.
"Yes, I must go. You have been kind. You are most generous."
But she went before him into the hall, waited, listened, for one instant, then threw open the outer door and bade him go. The rain dripped heavily from the eaves, and the cool breath of the freshened air was sweet and stimulating. She was immensely relieved to have him out of the house, but he lingered on the veranda, staring helplessly about.
"I shall go home," he said, but so unsteadily that she looked at him quickly.
He carried the cloak flung over his shoulder, and in readjusting it dropped it to the floor, and she saw in the light of the door lamps that his arm hung limp at his side, and the gray cloth of his sleeve was heavy and dark with blood. With a quick gesture she stooped and picked up the cloak. "Come, come! This is all very dreadful. You must go to a physician at once."
"My man and my horse are waiting for me. The injury is nothing." But she drew the cloak over his shoulders and led the way, across the veranda and out upon the walk. "I do not need a doctor. Not now. My man will care for me." He started through the dark toward the outer wall, as though confused, and she went before him toward the side entrance. He was aware of her quick light step, of the soft rustle of her skirts, of a wish to send her back which his tongue could not voice, but he knew that it was sweet to follow her leading. At the gate he took his bearings, with a new assurance and strength. "It seems that I always appear to you in some miserable fashion. It is preposterous for me to ask forgiveness, to thank you."
"Please say nothing at all, but go. Your enemies must not find you here again. You must leave the valley."
"I have a work to do, but it must not touch your life. Your happiness is too much, too sweet to me."
"You must leave the bungalow. I found out today where you are staying. There is a new danger there. The mountain people think you are a revenue officer. I told one of them—"
"Yes?"
"That you are not. That is enough. Now hurry away. You must find your horse and go."
He bent and kissed her hand. "You trust me. That is the dearest thing in the world."
His voice faltered and broke in a sob, for he was worn and weak, and the mystery of the night and the dark silent garden wove a spell upon him, and his heart leaped at the touch of his lips upon her fingers. Their fingers were only blurs in the dark, and their low tones died instantly, muffled by the night. She opened the gate as he began to promise not to appear before her again in any way to bring her trouble, but her low whisper arrested him. "Do not let them hurt you again," she said, and he felt her hand seek his, felt its cool furtive pressure for a moment, and then she was gone. He heard the house door close a moment later, and gazing across the garden, saw the lights on the veranda flash out. Then, with a smile on his face, he strode away to find Oscar and the horses. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 18. An Exchange of Messages. When youth was lord of my unchallenged fate, and time seemed but the vassal of my will, I entertained certain guests of state, the great of older days, who, faithful still, have kept with me the pact my youth had made. S. Weir Mitchell. "Who am I?" asked John Armitage, soberly. He tossed the stick of a match into the fireplace, where a pine knot smouldered, drew his pipe into a glow, and watched Oscar screw the top on a box of ointment which he had applied to Armitage's arm. The little soldier turned, and stood sharply at attention. "Yon are Mr. John Armitage, sir. A man's name is what he says it is. It is the rule of the country." "Thank you, Oscar. Your words reassure me. There have been times lately when I have been in doubt myself. You are a pretty good doctor." "First aid to the injured. I learned the trick from a hospital steward. If you are not poisoned, and do not die, you will recover, yes?" "Thank you, Sergeant. You are a consoling spirit. But I assure you on my honor as a gentleman that if I die I shall certainly haunt you. This is the 4th day. Tomorrow I shall throw away the bandage and be quite ready for more trouble." "It would be better on the 5th. The matter is settled. You will now go for the mail, and do take care that no one pots you on the way. Your death would be a positive loss to me, Oscar. And if anyone asks how my Majesty is, mark, my Majesty. Pray say that I am quite well, and equal to ruling over many kingdoms." "Yes, sire." And Armitage roared with laughter, as the little man, pausing as he buckled a cartridge belt under his coat, bowed with a fine mockery of reverence. "If a man were king he could have a devilish fine time of it, Oscar. He could review many troops, and they would fire salutes until the powder cost much money. You are mighty right, as we say in Montana. And I'll tell you quite confidentially, Sergeant, that if I were out of work and money and needed a job, the thought of being king might tempt me. These gentlemen who are trying to stick knives into me think highly of my chances. They may force me into the business." And Armitage rose and kicked the flaring knot. Oscar drew on his gauntlet with a jerk. "They killed the great Prime Minister, yes?" "They undoubtedly did, Oscar." "He was a good man. He was a very great man," said Oscar slowly, and went quickly out and closed the door softly after him. The life of the two men in the bungalow was established into a definite routine. Oscar was drilled in habits of observation and attention, and he realized without being told that some serious business was afoot. He knew that Armitage's life had been attempted, and that the receipt and dispatch of telegrams was a part of whatever errand had brought his master to the Virginia hills. His occupations were wholly to his liking. There was simple food to eat, there were horses to tend, and his errands abroad were of the nature of scouting, and in keeping with one's dignity who had been a soldier. He rose often at night to look abroad, and sometimes he found Armitage walking the veranda or returning from a tramp through the wood. Armitage spent much time studying papers, and once, the day after Armitage submitted his wounded arm to Oscar's care, he had seemed upon the verge of a confidence. To save life, to prevent disaster, to do a little good in the world, to do something for Austria. Such things are to the soul's credit, Oscar. And then Armitage's mood changed, and he had begun chaffing in a fashion that was beyond Oscar's comprehension. The little soldier rode over the hills to Lamar Station in the waning spring twilight, asked at the telegraph office for messages, stuffed Armitage's mail into his pockets at the post office, and turned home as the moonlight poured down the slopes and flooded the valleys. The Virginia roads have been cursed by larger armies than any that ever marched in Flanders, but Oscar was not a swearing man. He paused to rest his beast occasionally and to observe the landscape with the eye of a strategist. Moonlight, he remembered, was a useful accessory of the assassin's trade, and the faint sounds of the spring night were all promptly traced to their causes as they reached his alert ears. At the gate of the hunting park grounds he bent forward in the saddle to lift the chain that held it, urged his horse inside, bent down to refasten it, and as his fingers clutched the iron a man rose in the shadow of the little lodge and clasped him about the middle. The iron chain swung free and rattled against the post. The horse snorted with fright, then, at a word from Oscar, was still. There was the barest second of waiting, in which the long arms tightened, and the great body of his assailant hung heavily about him. Then he dug his spurs into the horse's flanks, and the animal leaped forward with a snort of rage, jumped out of the path, and tore away through the woods. Oscar's whole strength was taxed to hold his seat as the burly figure thumped against the horse's flanks. He had hoped to shake the man off, but the great arms still clasped him. The situation could not last. Oscar took advantage of the moonlight to choose a spot in which to terminate it. He had his bearings now, and as they crossed an opening in the wood he suddenly loosened his grip on the horse and flung himself backward. His assailant, no longer supported, rolled to the ground with Oscar on top of him, and the freed horse galloped away toward the stable. A rough and tumble fight now followed. Oscar's lithe, vigorous body writhed in the grasp of his antagonist, now free, now clasped by giant arms. They saw each other's faces plainly in the clear moonlight, and at breathless pauses in the struggle their eyes maintained the state of war. At one instant, when both men lay with arms interlocked, half lying upon their thighs, Oscar hissed in the giant's ear, "You are a Servian. It is an ugly race." And the Servian cursed him in a fierce growl. "We expected you. You are a bad hand with the knife," grunted Oscar, and feeling the bellows-like chest beside him expand, as though in preparation for a renewal of the fight, he suddenly wrenched himself free of the Servian's grasp, leaped away a dozen paces to the shelter of a great pine, and turned, revolver in hand. "Throw up your hands," he yelled. The Servian fired without pausing for aim, the shot ringing out sharply through the wood. Then Oscar discharged his revolver 3 times in quick succession, and while the discharges were still keen on the air, he drew back into a clump of underbrush and crept away a dozen yards to watch events. The Servian, with his eyes fixed upon the tree behind which his adversary had sought shelter, grew anxious, and thrust his head forward warily. Then he heard a sound as of someone running through the wood to the left and behind him, but still the man he had grappled on the horse made no sign. It dawned upon him that the 3 shots fired in front of him had been a signal, and in alarm he turned toward the gate, but a voice near at hand called out loudly, "Oscar!" and repeated the name several times. Behind the Servian the little soldier answered sharply in English, "All steady, sir." The use of a strange tongue added to the Servian's bewilderment, and he fled toward the gate, with Oscar hard after him. Then Armitage suddenly leaped out of the shadows directly in his path and stopped him with a levelled revolver. "Easy work, Oscar. Take the gentleman's gun, and be sure to find his knife." The task was to Oscar's taste, and he made quick work of the Servian's pockets. "Your horse was a good dispatch-bearer. You are all sound, Oscar?" "Never better, sir. A revolver and 2 knives." The weapons flashed in the moonlight as he held them up. "Good. Now start your friend toward the bungalow." They set off at a quick pace, soon found the rough driveway, and trudged along silently, the Servian between his captors. When they reached the house, Armitage flung open the door and followed Oscar and the prisoner into the long sitting-room. Armitage lighted a pipe at the mantel, readjusted the bandage on his arm, and laughed aloud as he looked upon the huge figure of the Servian standing behind the sober little cavalryman. "Oscar, there are certainly giants in these days, and we have caught one. You will please see that the cylinder of your revolver is in good order, and prepare to act as clerk of our court-martial. If the prisoner moves, shoot him." He spoke these last words very deliberately in German, and the Servian's small eyes blinked his comprehension. Armitage sat down on the writing-table, with his own revolver and the prisoner's knives and pistol within reach of his available hand. A smile of amusement played over his face as he scrutinized the big body and its small, bullet-like head. "He is a large devil," commented Oscar. "He is large, certainly," remarked Armitage. "Give him a chair. Now," he said to the man in deliberate German, "I shall say a few things to you which I am very anxious for you to understand. You are a Servian." The man nodded. "Your name is Zwei Militic." The man shifted his great bulk uneasily in his chair and fastened his lustreless little eyes upon Armitage. "Your name," repeated Armitage, "is Zmai Miletich. Your home is, or was, in the village of Toplica, where you were a blacksmith until you became a thief. You are employed as an assassin by 2 gentlemen known as Chauvenet and Durand. Do you follow me?" The man was indeed following him with deep engrossment. His narrow forehead was drawn into minute wrinkles. His small eyes seemed to recede into his head. His great body turned uneasily. "I ask you again," repeated Armitage, "whether you follow me. There must be no mistake." Oscar, anxious to take his own part in the conversation, prodded Zmai in the ribs with a pistol barrel, and the big fellow growled and nodded his head. There is a house in the outskirts of Vienna where you have been employed at times as gardener, and another house in Geneva where you wait for orders. At this latter place it was my great pleasure to smash you in the head with a boiling pot on a certain evening in March." The man scowled and ejaculated an oath with so much venom that Armitage laughed. "Your conspirators are engaged upon a succession of murders, and when they have removed the last obstacle, they will establish a new Emperor King in Vienna, and you will receive a substantial reward for what you have done." The blood suffused the man's dark face, and he half rose, a great roar of angry denial breaking from him. "That will do. You tried to kill me on the King Edward. You tried your knife on me again down there in Judge Claiborne's garden. And you came up here tonight with a plan to kill my man and then take your time to me. Give me the mail, Oscar." He opened the letters which Oscar had brought and scanned several that bore a Paris postmark, and when he had pondered their contents a moment, he laughed and jumped from the table. He brought a portfolio from his bedroom and sat down to write. "Don't shoot the gentleman as long as he is quiet. You may even give him a glass of whiskey to soothe his feelings." Armitage wrote, "Monsieur, your assassin is a clumsy fellow, and you will do well to send him back to the blacksmith shop at Toplica. I learn that Monsieur Durand, distressed by the delay of affairs in America, will soon join you, is even now aboard the Tacoma, bound for New York. I am profoundly grateful for this, dear Monsieur, as it gives me an opportunity to conclude our interesting business in Republican territory without prejudice to any of the parties chiefly concerned. You are a clever and daring rogue, yet at times you strike me as immensely dull, Monsieur. Ponder this. Should it seem expedient for me to establish my identity, which I am sure interests you greatly, before Baron von Marhof and, we will add, the American Secretary of State, be quite sure that I shall not do so until I have taken precautions against your departure in any unseemly haste. I, myself, dear friend, am not without a certain facility in setting traps." Armitage threw down the pen and read what he had written with care. Then he wrote as signature the initials F.A., enclosed the note in an envelope and addressed it, pondered again, laughed and slapped his knee, and went into his room, where he rummaged about until he found a small seal beautifully wrought in bronze and a bit of wax. Returning to the table, he lighted a candle and deftly sealed the letter. He held the red scar on the back of the envelope to the lamp and examined it with interest. The lines of the seal were deep cut, and the impression was perfectly distinct, of F.A. in English script, linked together by the bar of the F. "Oscar, what do you recommend that we do with the prisoner?" "He should be tied to a tree and shot, or perhaps it would be better to hang him to the rafters in the kitchen. Yet he is heavy, and might pull down the roof. You are a bloodthirsty wretch, and there is no mercy in you. Private executions are not allowed in this country. You would have us before a Virginia grand jury and our own necks stretched. No, we shall send him back to his master." "It is a mistake. If your Excellency would go away for an hour, he should never know where the buzzards found this large carcass." "Tush, I would not trust his valuable life to you. Get up," he commanded, and Oscar jerked Zmai to his feet. "You deserve nothing at my hands, but I need a discreet messenger, and you shall not die tonight, as my worthy adjutant recommends. Tomorrow night, however, or the following night, or any other old night, as we say in America, if you show yourself in these hills, my chief of staff shall have his way with you. Buzzard meat." "The orders are understood," said Oscar, thrusting the revolver into the giant's ribs. "Now, Zmai, blacksmith of Toplica, and assassin at large, here is a letter for Monsieur Chauvenet. It is still early. When you have delivered it, bring back to me the envelope with Monsieur's reply written right here, under the seal. Do you understand?" It had begun to dawn on Zmai that his life was not in immediate danger, and the light of intelligence kindled again in his strange little eyes. Lest he might not fully grasp the errand with which Armitage entrusted him, Oscar repeated what Armitage had said in somewhat coarser terms. Again through the moonlight strode the three, out of Armitage's land to the valley road, and to the same point to which Shirley Claiborne had only a few days before been escorted by the mountaineer. There they sent the Servian forward to the springs, and Armitage went home, leaving Oscar to wait for the return of the receipt. It was after midnight when Oscar placed it in Armitage's hands at the bungalow. "Oscar, it would be a dreadful thing to kill a man," Armitage declared, holding the empty envelope to the light and reading the lines scrawled beneath the unbroken wax. It was in French. "You are to die young, monsieur." "A man, more or less," and Oscar shrugged his shoulders. "You are not a good churchman. It is a grievous sin to do murder." "One may repent. It is so written. The people of your house are Catholics also." "That is quite true, though I may seem to forget it. Our work will soon be done, please God, and we shall ask the Blessed Sacrament somewhere in these hills." Oscar crossed himself and fell to cleaning his rifle. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 19. Captain Claiborne on duty. When he came to where the trees were thin, the moon sat waiting there to see. On her worn palm she laid her chin, and laughed awhile in sober glee to think how strong this night had been. William Vaughn Moody. In some mystification, Captain Richard Claiborne packed a suitcase in his quarters at Fort Myer. Being a soldier, he obeyed orders, but being human, he was also possessed of a degree of curiosity. He did not know just the series of incidents and conferences that preceded his summons to Washington, but they may be summarized thus. Baron von Marhof was a cautious man. When the young gentlemen of his legation spoke to him in awed whispers of a cigarette case bearing an extraordinary device that had been seen in Washington, he laughed them away. Then, possessing a curious and thorough mind, he read all the press clippings related to the false Baron von Kissel, and studied the heraldic emblems of the Schombergs. As he pondered, he regretted the death of his eminent brother-in-law, Count Ferdinand von Stroebel, who was not a man to stumble over so negligible a trifle as a cigarette case. But von Marhof himself was not without resources. He told the gentlemen of his suite that he had satisfied himself that there was nothing in the Armitage mystery. Then he cabled Vienna discreetly for a few days, and finally consulted Hilton Claiborne, the embassy's counsel, at the Claiborne home in Storm Springs. They had both gone hurriedly to Washington, where they held a long conference with the Secretary of State. Then the State Department called the War Department by telephone, and quickly down the line to the commanding officer at Fort Myer went a special assignment for Captain Claiborne to report to the Secretary of State. A great deal of perfectly sound red tape was reduced to minute particles in these manipulations. But Baron von Marhof's business was urgent. It was also of a private and wholly confidential character. Therefore, he returned to his cottage at Storm Springs, and the Washington papers stated that he was ill and had gone back to Virginia to take the waters. The Claiborne house was the pleasantest place in Storm Valley, and the library a comfortable place for a conference. Dick Claiborne caught the gravity of the older men as they unfolded to him the task for which they had asked his services. The Baron stated the case in these words: "You know and have talked with this man Armitage. You saw the device on the cigarette case, and asked an explanation, which he refused. And you know also Chauvenet, whom we suspect of complicity with the conspirators at home. Armitage is not the false Baron von Kissel. We have established that from Senator Sanderson beyond question. But Sanderson's knowledge of the man is of comparatively recent date, going back about 5 years to the time Armitage purchased a Montana ranch. Whoever Armitage may be, he pays his bills. He conducts himself like a gentleman. He travels at will, and people who meet him say a good word for him." "He is an agreeable man, and remarkably well posted in European politics," said Judge Claiborne. "I talked with him a number of times on the King Edward, and I must say that I liked him." "Chauvenet evidently knows him. There was undoubtedly something back of that little trick at my supper party at the Army and Navy," said Dick. "It might be explained," began the Baron. Then he paused and looked from father to son. "Pardon me, but they both manifest the same interest in Miss Claiborne." "We met them abroad," said Dick, "and they both turned up again in Washington." "One of them is here, or has been here in the valley. Why not the other?" asked Judge Claiborne. "But, of course, Shirley knows nothing of Armitage's whereabouts," Dick protested. "Certainly not," declared his father. "How did you make Armitage's acquaintance?" asked the Ambassador. "Some one must have been responsible for introducing him, if you can remember." Dick laughed. "It was at the Monte Rosa, at Geneva. Shirley and I had been chaffing each other about the persistence with which Armitage seemed to follow us. He was taking déjeuner at the same hour, and he passed us going out. Old Arthur Singleton, the ubiquitous, was talking to us, and he nailed Armitage with his customary zeal and introduced him to us in quite the usual American fashion. Later I asked Singleton who he was, and he knew nothing about him. Then Armitage turned up on the steamer, where he made himself most agreeable. Next, Senator Sanderson vouched for him as one of his Montana constituents. You know the rest of the story. I swallowed him whole. He called at our house on several occasions, and came to the post, and I asked him to my supper for the Spanish attaché. And now, Dick, we want you to find him and get him into a room with ourselves, where we can ask him some questions," declared Judge Claiborne. They discussed the matter in detail. It was agreed that Dick should remain at the Springs for a few days to watch Chauvenet. Then, if he got no clue to Armitage's whereabouts, he was to go to Montana to see if anything could be learned there. "We must find him. There must be no mistake about it," said the Ambassador to Judge Claiborne when they were alone. "They are almost panic-stricken in Vienna. What with the match burning close to the powder in Hungary, and clever heads plotting in Vienna, this American end of the game has dangerous possibilities." "And when we have young Armitage," the judge began, "then we shall know the truth." "But suppose, and Judge Claiborne glanced at the door, "suppose Charles Louis, Emperor King of Austria-Hungary, should die, tonight, tomorrow." "We will assume nothing of the kind," ejaculated the Ambassador sharply. "It is impossible." Then to Captain Claiborne, "You must pardon me if I do not explain further. I wish to find Armitage. It is of the greatest importance. It would not aid you if I told you why I must see and talk with him." And as though to escape from the thing of which his counsel had hinted, Baron von Marhof took his departure at once. Shirley met her brother on the veranda. His arrival had been unheralded, and she was frankly astonished to see him. "Well, Captain Claiborne, you are a man of mystery. You will undoubtedly be court-martialed for deserting, and after a long leave, too." "I am on duty. Don't forget that you are the daughter of a diplomat." "Huh! It doesn't follow necessarily that I should be stupid." "You couldn't be that, Shirley dear." "Thank you, Captain." They discussed family matters for a few minutes. Then she said, with elaborate irreverence, "Well, we must hope that your appearance will cause no battles to be fought in our garden. There was enough fighting about here in old times." "Take heart, little sister. I shall protect you. Oh, it's rather decent of Armitage to have kept away from you, Shirley, after all that fuss about the bogus Baron." "Which he wasn't." "Well, Sanderson says he couldn't have been, and the Rogues Gallery pictures don't resemble our friend at all." "Ugh, don't speak of it," and Shirley shrugged her shoulders. She suffered her eyes to climb the slopes of the far hills. Then she looked steadily at her brother and laughed. "What do you and father and Baron von Marhof want with Mr. John Armitage?" she asked. "Guess again!" exclaimed Dick hurriedly. "Has that been the undercurrent of your conversation? As I may have said before in this connection, you disappoint me, Shirley. You seem unable to forget that fellow." He paused, grew very serious, and bent forward in his wicker chair. Have you seen John Armitage since I saw him?"
"Impertinent! How dare you?"
"But surely, the question is fair."
"Is it, Richard?"
"And I want you to answer me."
"That's different."
He rose and took several steps toward her. She stood against the railing with her hands behind her back. "Shirley, you are the finest girl in the world, but you wouldn't do this."
"This what, Dick?"
"You know what I mean. I ask you again, have you or have you not seen Armitage since you came to the Springs?" He spoke impatiently, his eyes upon hers. A wave of color swept her face, and then her anger passed, and she was her usual good-natured self.
"Baron von Marhof is a charming old gentleman, isn't he?"
"He's a regular old brick," declared Dick solemnly.
"It's a great privilege for young men like you to know him, Dick, and to have private talks with him and the governor about subjects of deep importance. The governor is a good deal of a man himself."
"I am proud to be his son," declared Dick, meeting Shirley's eyes unflinchingly. Shirley was silent for a moment, while Dick whistled a few bars from the latest waltz.
"A captain, a mere captain of the line, is not often plucked out of his post when in good health and standing, after a long leave for foreign travel, and sent away to visit his parents, and help entertain a distinguished ambassador."
"Thanks for the mere captain, dearest. You needn't rub it in."
"I wouldn't, but you are fair game, for your sister only, and you're better known than you were before that little supper for the Spanish attaché. It rather directed attention to you, didn't it, Dick?"
Dick colored. "It certainly did."
"And if you should meet Monsieur Chauvenet, who caused the trouble—"
"I have every intention of meeting him."
"Oh!"
"Of course, I shall meet him, sometime, somewhere. He's at the Springs, isn't he?"
"Am I a hotel register that I should know? I haven't seen him for several days."
"What I should like to see," said Dick, "is a meeting between Armitage and Chauvenet. That would really be entertaining. No doubt Chauvenet could whip your mysterious suitor."
He looked away, with an air of unconcern, at the deepening shadows on the mountains. "Dear Dick, I am quite sure if you had been chosen out of all the United States Army to find Mr. John Armitage, you will succeed without any help from me."
"That doesn't answer my question. You don't know what you are doing. What if father knew that you were seeing this adventurer?"
"Oh, of course, if you should tell father. I haven't said that I had seen Mr. Armitage, and you haven't exactly told me that you have a warrant for his arrest. So we are at quits, Captain. You had better look in at the hotel dance tonight. There are girls there, and to spare."
"When I find Mr. Armitage—"
"You seem hopeful, Captain. He may be on the high seas."
"I shall find him there, or here."
"Good luck to you, Captain." There was the least flash of antagonism in the glance that passed between them, and Captain Claiborne clapped his hands together impatiently and went into the house. Chapter 19